Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity? Oh, Jesus.
Have I told you the definition of mediocrity? If you look at its etymology in Latin, it comes out to halfway up the mountain. In plainer terms, it means ordinariness, not outstanding. I can't think of a better phrase to describe Far Cry 6. I almost didn't make this video. I'd written down 2,000 to 3,000 words of notes, annotated all my footage, and was ready to go once I'd knocked out some smaller projects. But when the time came to get down to the editing, I just kind of sighed. Perhaps it was my end-of-year realization I probably needed to switch over to long-form reviews to please the algorithm and see more channel growth. Most likely this realization was made more tenuous by YouTube messing everything up further by demonetizing anyone due to violence and naughty language, which is kind of my bread and butter. Not the most motivating news, right? But rewatching some footage and trying my damnedest not to let the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune pierce my tender little heart, I began, bit by bit, to feel the pieces coming back together. At first, I wondered if this review would just be too much complaining, too much negativity, and then I realized that's not really my problem.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
Ubisoft especially has been pushing it for a long time, making games with such scope and production value that nearly evaporate from my memory afterwards. AC Odyssey and Valhalla's Bloat, Immortals Phoenix Rising and Valhalla both corrupting my save files after like 10 hours into each, and more. Far Cry 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. I mean, 4 was okay, and 5 gets better the longer I play 6, but nothing can compare to the first time I traipsed across the Rook Islands. But no one can deny that for all they've done since, the core of the series has gone a little too untouched or improved upon since that game-changing third installment. So when Far Cry 3.5, Far Cry 6, as you normies call it, started getting hyped in the press, I was surprisingly stoked by the carnage and explosiveness of the Rambo fantasies on display. Finally, it looks like the bar is being raised, I thought. This is the last major release from the 2021 I finally got around to playing, but was it worth the wait? Not terribly. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, and there are certainly short, controlled bursts of fun to be had here, but it's a far cry from fantastic and rarely replicates all the explosiveness we saw in those trailers. And that's what sucks. Far Cry's always been about those Rambo fantasies, but Far Cry 6 feels like a decidedly wide puddle that barely gets your toes wet. It's the most unpolished Far Cry I've played, it has the most underwhelming story of any game since Far Cry 3, and it replaces the enjoyable parts of the series like its skill trees and crafting for looter shooter and level gating tropes that feel as lazy and uninspired as they did in the recent Assassin's Creed games. But value judgments mean nothing without proof, which is my speciality. So let's get stuck into the nitty-gritty and see if it's worth playing Far Cry 3 for the 5th time, or whether we should just take this one down and drag it into a dark corner.
Number 5 was totally worth it.
Them nice and tight, or we all go boom.
Now, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't pay much attention to Far Cry 6's marketing, aggressive as it was. Giancarlo Esposito is a fun guy to watch.
I'm a fun guy.
But his Gus Fring-like portrayal of Anton Castillo seems more like an appeal to his nerd cred than an inspired acting choice. Turns out, he's not the problem with the character, but we'll get more into that later. As vivacious as the marketing was, it's also prophetic for a game that can't be serious about its subject matter long enough to make you care, so it ends up being low-stakes, vapid ubisoft the whole way through. There's not an interesting thought conveyed about fascist dictatorships or the moral gray area some revolutionaries traffic in to fight back against said dictatorships. Nothing. And what makes this all the more comical is how high-minded the lead writer Naveed Khavari is about the script. Having worked on Far Cry Primal and Far Cry 5, Khavari is not unfamiliar with what makes a series tick, but he also seems incapable of grasping just how shallow the series' political and moral commentaries have been to date. He actually describes the building blocks of a Far Cry game as a balance of mature storytelling that isn't afraid to tackle difficult themes, mixed with some levity. Now, if you didn't know this quotation existed and just played the games and then were asked, hey, what would you describe the game as, you'd get this quotation. We balance an emphasis on action and levity with some forays into mature themes, because it's really how things actually play out. That said, 6 is technically their most specifically moralistic Far Cry game, with an emphasis on LGBTQ revolutionaries being at odds with Yarn cultural norms as upheld by Castillo. But that sentence right there implies a much more provocative conversation than the game ever actually partakes in. There's some serious missed opportunities to make the conflict as morally gray as Khavari thinks it is, describing the revolutionaries as comprised of a mix of ideologies and perspectives. We tend to see revolutions as black and white, but they're incredibly complicated conflicts, and anyone who studies them will tell you that. So rather than tell a simple story with a binary point of view, we embrace that complexity.
You serious?
Khavari, like most game writers, likes talking about the complexity of the topics mentioned in a game, but oftentimes the game is incapable of anything but a punk rock sensibility that pushes for contrived scenarios to score political points while failing to engender a sense of danger and moral conflict. Khavari and company just proved the expectation right that these games can't or won't support the seriousness of these themes, even in a crude Tarantino-esque way. So let's get into the narrative and its central players to see why this didn't work. Let's start out with what I did like about the story presentation before I go into a litany of what I think is lacking. The cinematic direction of the cutscenes and the animations are all top tier. Voice acting is generally pretty decent, but still kind of sounds like high school theater. There's lots of really played up Garia and Paradise, pronunciations that sound strangely detached from the lightly accented diction otherwise. But while the dialogue's often terrible, the cutscenes are nice to look at. Character models are smooth and well animated, and some really stand out like Castillo's recognizable mug, the Resistance leader Clara, and the female version of your player character, both of whom are smoke shows. Speaking of the player character, you play as ex-military person Danny Rojas, who's either male or female depending on your preference, and you and your buddies open the game drinking on a rooftop in Yara, watching a newscast on TV from President Anton Castillo as he details his master plan for the island. Yara, an obvious analog for Cuba and the Castro regime, has been shut down economically by a political blockade after a guerrilla revolution in 1967. Castillo seeks to return Yara to its former glory by selling their primary export of cigars, except that they're laced with a cancer-curing drug called Viviro. Making a cancer-causing substance the cure for cancer is a contrivance so outrageous it's actually endearing. But it's even funnier that it's not the tobacco that's the bad news, it's the fact that the tobacco fields are sprayed with a poisonous hallucinogenic pesticide called PG-240X. Oh, and the fact that Castillo tests Viviro out on his slaves and political prisoners. That's bad too, I think. This dude will kill, experiment, and otherwise deface anyone and anything to regain his family's power structure. What a jerk. Now, after a run-in with Castillo's troops, you and your friends are captured. Only you escape alive with the knowledge that a resistance front called Libertad is out there, waiting to strike. Once you find them, you'll strive to unite them with the other guerrilla factions that oppose Castillo, all of which have different motivations and expectations for their fight and also what they expect to gain from winning it. There's a bunch of young guns fired up to fight back, but you realize that you need the help of some of the old guard too from the last revolution, the Legends of 67 as they're called. These cats lend some much needed contrast to all the millennial cheesiness, but they disappear from the narrative's trajectory halfway through and the game suffers for it. The ingredients are here for a cool story that'll lend itself to interesting and moral quandaries, but you're really just being asked to vibe with revolutionary platitudes, listening to your annoying compatriots stunt around between gunfights, and just taking the game's word for it that you should hate Castillo. As much gravitas as the game lends him, Castillo's a one-note, easy-to-hate villain who invites no sympathy or nuance. Giancarlo Esposito is doing his thing, but he's definitely playing to type here, and his monologues harken back to the best of Breaking Bad's Gus Fring.
Explain yourself.
Full of pompous self-justification for his crimes. His motion capture is also a little unsettling, with weird stiffness and freaky expressions popping in and out. He's regulated to cutscenes and really doesn't have a ton of agency, so he's basically just a marketing figurehead. He's better than Pagan Men, but that doesn't say much. His son Diego is painted as this conflicted figure that helps out Danny from time to time, while still trying to follow in his father's footsteps. But Diego's arc never fully closes and feels like a wasted opportunity to leverage some relatable decency out of Castillo. And so Castillo just looms in the background, as if he's taken the appointed villain seat and you as the audience are supposed to know what he represents and do the revolution thing. He's dull. His compatriots are even duller. Admiral Benitez's most interesting characteristic is that she's an admiral, but also a mother. So I guess you really can have it all, except a personality.
The criminals of La Libertad will be stopped.
Yeah.
They're few, we are many.
You hear that?
She gets cornered at one point, and then you watch as countless of her cronies spawn in a comically assembly line kind of way. You kill these people till she's vulnerable, and then you gat her down. The rest of Castillo's band of merry men are bland or unremarkable, one character even being killed in a cutscene versus being the star of their own region. Only the sleazy Canadian Prime Minister McKay stands out, but he's out of the picture before long. None of the boss encounters with these guys are memorable save for one helicopter sequence where you're stuck atop a small tower and have to pop and shoot to take the helicopter down that's circling the tower. But by the time you've done this, you'll have fought 30 helicopters already, so it's not nearly as memorable as it could be. Oh, and last but not least about the bad guys, for a story about brutal oppression, the most evidence you'll see of this is the occasional spat between freedom fighters and Castillo troops, and some story beats where people are imprisoned or experimented on. It only comes up when convenient, and otherwise, Yara feels like a tropical paradise that's open to your exploration and whimsy, like a nice tourist spot. There's very little sense that anything particularly bad is going on in Yara as opposed to any other open world ever. Okay, so the villains aren't great, but how about your allies? Well, they're worse somehow. With the exception of two characters, the aforementioned Clara and the colorful El Tigre, your entire group of homies are some of the most cringy side characters since Ubisoft set a new low with Dead Cell and Watch Dogs 2.
That suck.
They're written with all the deftness of
How do you do, fellow kids?
and look like cosplay convention goers. Nothing about their outfits looks beleaguered or worn down. They really just look like they got their pick of top-shelf Hot Topic items. Your comrade Bicho looks like a pineapple and makes bad, self-aware jokes in a baby voice, and he's one of the most tolerable. One character complains about being made fun of at a party for being vegan.
I asked them to make room for my veggies, and everyone starts making fun of my veganness.
The mechanic Philly is an obnoxious gator hat wearing meme lord mechanic trying to seem adorably crazy. One of the Monteros, whose name I don't even care to look up, I lied. It's Talia, and she dorkily raps over combat about how progressive the gorillas are and how they have a will the size of a stadium. You know, real OG kind of stuff.
Gangsta shit!
And that's just their personalities. Don't even get me started on how hard they are to believe as effective warriors. When their guerrilla operations actually work somehow, and they manage to capture important associates of Castillo, they almost always whiff the interrogation, murdering them in a childish fit of rage before they can even extract any information out of them or use them as leverage. In one situation, Libertad captures Castillo's mistress to use her as a bargaining chip, but while tied up, she keeps taunting Talia about her relationship with the trans character Montanzas, causing Talia to snap and unload a magazine into her. Danny swears and they have to bolt, but the wanton killing of everyone in your way seems to be the only outcome that's not frowned upon, even if it didn't gain the revolution any momentum. Another instance is when Danny and the team corner the right-hand man to El Doctor, the doctor responsible for the human Viviro experimentation, and while they're interrogating him for the location of El Doctor, Montanzas just blows the guy away for no reason, midway through. All Danny can do is swear yet again, and the team moves on like,
Dang it! Well, that place was a ripoff.
that's it? There are just no consequences to their lack of self-control and battlefield smarts. This disconnect between action and consequence is rampant elsewhere too. If you'll remember, the very first cutscene shows one of Danny Rojas's idiot friends getting killed after pointlessly throwing a beer bottle at a tank because they were mad someone got murdered in the street. Righteous indignation noted. The response? Who is it helping? This stunt gives Danny and her friends away, and they end up getting captured, and then they decide to get in Castillo's face with his armed guard present, and are promptly gunned down. The pointless bravado as bravery trope is so overused and try-hard in this game because characters act like showy defiance is worth their life, and it really turned me off from taking too much of the good guys seriously. Ubisoft seems more interested in contriving these punk rock, like, hell yeah moments, instead of making a believable war play out with actual sacrifices like, you know, baseline patience or some semblance of strategy beyond wanton violence. The good guys are almost uniformly annoying, foolish, incompetent, and immature. There are even weird logical disconnects, like when your weapons dealer Juan Cortez tells you to stand down as he's agreed to spare the corrupt Canadian Prime Minister McKay in exchange for a huge cash injection to Libertad. If you ignore Cortez's wishes and just murder McKay straight up, Juan Cortez says nothing in response over the radio and shows up in the next cutscene with no visible annoyance at all that you justified his deal. There's also this weird cutscene in which you're rescuing a prisoner who's about to be executed, and the prisoner's father grabs him but notices that his son's got a bomb strapped to him, and instead of cutting the bomb off and throwing it away, he cuts the bomb off, throws his son to safety, and rides away to keep the blast from affecting anyone else. Now, unfortunately, this isn't heroism, it's illogical and ridiculous, since he just did the same amount of work to throw the bomb away as he would have to free his son and drive away from the bomb himself. It's just so stupid. And also, let me get one spoilerific illogicality out of the way first. Okay, you ready? Well, it turns out Castillo's got leukemia and has basically been keenly interested in Viviro for personal reasons as a cure for himself. As it turns out, the Viviro stops being effective after so many years, and about 2/3 of the way through the game, and after only seeing the man for a couple cutscenes, Castillo is dying. At the end of the game, when cornered and asked to surrender, Castillo doesn't believe that Libertad will take care of his son, and so he kills his son and himself. From a gameplay perspective, it's anticlimactic to have the villain escape judgment at your hands, and it's also a completely insane character turn. Castillo's whole thing is reclaiming his country's lost legacy and furthering his family name, and he tries to indoctrinate his son at every single point, and now you're telling me he'd rather kill his own son than have it change even slightly? It's just so weird and over the top and seems designed for shock value above all else. Worse yet, you're not given any choice about whether to keep producing Viviro to help some people with cancer or outright stop the production. Either way, some people are getting hurt and some people are getting help. The game's most obvious moral quandary isn't given a moment's notice. All that being said, the story's never truly terrible, just kind of bland or embarrassing with only slight highlights like the El Tigre character. It's mostly just harmlessly forgettable because it's not striving for anything substantial. They killed off one of the only side characters I liked by the time the story wrapped, and by that time my enthusiasm was waning anyway. The ending encounter is super mediocre, and the final conflict or lack thereof flies in the face of characterization to date and feels wildly unfulfilling. Any socially significant or emotionally resonant scene is rendered goofy by how irresponsibly the characters handle it, and since these actions are never impacted, I don't ever end up believing in their cause or taking them seriously as warriors. Okay, so I think we firmly established the story sucks. So what does the actual gameplay and world have in store for us? Any relief from the mediocrity? Well, the world's brightness and tropicality failing to sell the weakest hell story is actually a net positive for the player, as it'll remind you of all the great things about the Rook Islands of Far Cry 3. Ubisoft does great tropical settings, as evidenced by Assassin's Creed Black Flag, and it's no different here, even mixing in foliage and mountains that reminded me of Far Cry 4 and 5. The skyboxes are beautiful. The god rays feel, well, godly. There's a great contrast and diversity of environmental assets like mountains, trees, grass, and sand that flow together well against each other and feel truly lush and vibrant. More important than looks, however, is the environmental interactivity and travel options. You'll get access to all the best tools and vehicles from past games like the grappling hook, wingsuit, planes, helicopters, bikes, trucks, and tanks. But be forewarned, as diverse as these travel options are, the environments are often ill-suited to accompany convenient travel with them, as your vehicle's FOVs are often way too small and you can get stuck quite a bit on rocks. I ended up running much of the time to avoid all the pitfalls of the stupid vehicles, but even this had a really bad downside. Fall damage is unreal high, and you have a lot of momentum now that will send you flying to your death through even a slight skid down the side of a mountain. It's so frustrating to randomly die from one of these falls and respawn hundreds of meters back and have to make the trek again. I guess now is as good a time as any to segue into the quality of life stuff that was added and what other frustrations have been baked into this new entry. They finally added cool stuff like automatically picking up items from corpses as you pass over them as opposed to having to click to activate an animation. There's a ton of accessibility options from voice menus and other sliders to accommodate people, which is a really nice thing to have. Unfortunately, the game participates in cursor menu controls even on console, which are just the most annoying thing Destiny has ever popularized. The activate function is also super exacting, making you have to get close enough to smell something's breath to make the prompt appear, and then you have to hold the button down for at least a couple seconds to get it to fully complete, making sure not to move or it'll go away again. Other goofy aspects of the game are the slow, frequently needed healing or swimming animations. While spending all that time walking, you'll often have to cross a small river or creek at the other side, and it's the slowest you've ever swam in the series' history, turning what should be a quick, refreshing dip into an Olympic swim meet. Combat often gums you up with too many inputs as you're constantly getting knocked down and having to do a recovery animation, or having to heal or put out fires, and it just feels like a toddler constantly trying to get your attention, asking 500 questions a minute and tugging on your sleeve. It's like, stop. One way to offset these annoyances somewhat is to figure out Far Cry 6's combat and character build gimmicks. The major changes here are that you earn XP and level up now, but only as a way to make sure your weapon damage scales with the enemy health bars based on the region you're in. You no longer unlock skills as you go based on XP gain. You either perform side tasks to unlock special weapons to keep in your inventory for good, as opposed to pulling them out of a locker, or the more likely thing, you find them in chests littered around the world. You also don't really hunt animals to craft new items anymore. Legendary animals exist, but they're hard to find on the map. The menus don't keep track of them anywhere that I could see, and they often have annoyingly specific times of day they appear, but with no way to speed up time in game. And as for the shooting itself, the aiming never feels quite right on console no matter what you tinker with. The sensitivity is all over the place no matter what you choose, and you must simply turn auto aim off because it'll fight your inputs unless you're aiming exactly what it wants you to. This makes the already puny sniper rifles even harder to use, although thankfully the pistols, SMGs, shotguns, and rifles are pretty stout. Well, they become stout, I should say. Far Cry 6 is like a looter shooter in that you'll need to keep seeking out better gear because your early gear is pretty wimpy. Enemies no longer drop their weapons, which is an awfully unimmersive choice and takes away the fun of killing a heavy to get their machine gun like in Far Cry 3, and as a result, you'll need to keep scouring the island's chest for better stuff like the ridiculous Borderlands-esque fire damage guns that turn the tides overwhelmingly in your favor. And because of how the high-level areas work, even these weapons could lose their efficacy. And that's not great because of how hard the enemies are to kill already and how they seem to just infinitely spawn. The AI is super erratic and jittery in its movement, unpredictable in all the wrong ways because they don't act in logical self-interest much. Damage scaling for bad guys also seems off, as setting them on fire or hitting them with a truck rarely ever truly kills them, just leaving them alive with a sliver of health so that someone you thought was down for the count can wander back into the fight like Rumpelstiltskin getting up from a nap and start shooting you in the back. I also noticed the game has this underexplained ammo type strategy where you need to pay attention to who's wearing armor and only use armor-piercing rounds on them, but this is as awkward as it was in Wolfenstein Youngblood. No one wants to sit back and scan every single guy, then try to remember which one required which ammo type, nor does anyone want to swap guns mid-fight because their normal bullet's suddenly no good because an armored guy got in your way while you're shooting the guy without armor. This awkwardness is compounded when you think about how on console you can carry every weapon in your inventory for good, but you only have 4 slots in your in-game weapon wheel. I always had a bow, 2 DPS weapons, and my armor-piercing autocrat pistol, which never did me wrong. But I ended up having to constantly pause the game and go into the menus to swap out my stuff for a rocket launcher because, I'd alert a guard and reinforcements and helicopters would spawn in for minutes at a time like I had a 5-star alert in Grand Theft Auto. Now, it's not enough, but Ubisoft does try to help you even the odds with 2 cool new weapon types called Devolvers and Supremos. The Devolvers are special weapons that Juan Cortez crafts for you using the nuclear waste found at anti-aircraft sites. And these are wild and creative weapons like a nail gun, a vinyl record launcher, a crossbow, pneumatic sniper rifle, an awesome shield and shotgun combo, and more. The Supremos are the backpack weapons you probably saw in the trailers, and these are essentially superpowers on a cooldown that has sweet effects like shooting rockets, poisoning your enemies with PG-240X so that they attack each other, or turning invisible. Supremos are fun and inventive ideas, but the very first one you get is basically a mortar strike from your back that auto-targets the nearest enemies. It can one-shot tanks and helicopters or blow up anti-air artillery in one hit, so there's really no reason to ever use anything else, as they are novelties, not necessities. Adding further depth to combat are AI partners called Amigos that you can hire much like your buddies in Far Cry 5, except they're all animals here. They're a colorful bunch too, including a hound, a dachshund with wheels for back legs, or a trained alligator. These 3 are cool and all, but the latter 2, a spirit panther and a rampaging rooster, are much more aggressive and useful. Overall, I got really excited to use these creatures because of how well they were marketed and how distinctive and fun they looked and act. But I went a good 20 to 30 hours not even remembering they were available, which is kind of awkward. They're fun to use, and the game with AI buddies are always more fun because of them. Just be wary that sometimes they don't always work as intended, as you'll try and summon them and they won't show up for like 5 to 10 minutes. But, they'll get there eventually.
I'm coming! Chosen one! I'm coming! Chosen one! I'm coming!
Well, now that I've spent a lot of time talking story gameplay and general world design, I've noticed that we've not talked about the mission structures, new or old, so let's do that. Main story missions are assigned each region's faction, like the Monteros, and you go and do favors for them so they'll join you against Castillo. There are some callbacks here, like the obligatory and played out burn the field with fire thing they've done since Far Cry 2, but most missions are fairly rote and not terribly interesting, especially the last level. But there are a butt ton of side activities, which, though obviously since we're talking Ubisoft, only a couple don't suck. The previously mentioned anti-aircraft tasks are alright, but fairly basic. Go in there, blow up the AA guns, take the radioactive waste to make weapons, and get out. Clearing out checkpoints is alright. They're basically these little convenient story areas that have spikes around them to pop your tires if you try and run through them, so you'll have to stop and do a little murdering, then break the Castillo poster nearby. You'll also get 2 types of supply drop missions, one where you aid fellow Libertad members in fighting Castillo's men to secure a drop, or timed missions that'll task you with getting one of these drops before the timer expires, then killing all the bad guys to take said drop. These are pretty bland, though sometimes the movement challenges to get there can be pretty fun to pull off, as they ask you to go from your wingsuit to long slides down a mountainside to jet skiing. Abstract, text-based Bandito side missions remind me of the Assassin's Creed Brotherhood chores that you did. These are fun, but fairly unremarkable, and seem to be here more as an homage to past Ubisoft titles than anything else, netting you little rewards like new weapons. Treasure hunts prove to be some of the most fun the series has ever striven for. These are spelunking challenges oftentimes where you'll use your grappling hook to navigate a cave to find the goods within, and other times you'll be given an environmental puzzle to solve. These actually require you to pay attention to landmarks and clues to solve them, like these boat puzzles, one of which requires you to figure out the name of someone's wife from a poem and then see which of the boats is named after her to find your clue, or a similar one where you have to find a combination code but only in specific boats. They're fun and engaging without being brain busters, although there was one with a cabinet full of switches that had to be flipped in a certain order that kinda threw me for a loop. This kind of stuff was needed throughout the game instead of just switch looping and shooting, a sense of tight but relaxed adventure to balance out the constant combat, but unfortunately it's in short supply. Oh, and speaking of combat, the more action-ended side tasks are the bases, which occupy the outpost spot from previous games. Bases are much bigger than outposts ever were, though, having plenty of alarms throughout and spread out enemy configurations, so getting through them without incident can be pretty tricky. A fair few are boring, but there are some real standouts like a university that felt distinct and interesting to take down and then have to defend as needed once the helicopters came in. The PG-240X missions were also really fun, too, and these are essentially challenge maps that can be played co-op. My favorite was the dinosaur park level with dinosaur models spread out underneath a really nice skybox. Once you make your way through it one way, you'll find your objective, an isotope that can't be exposed to too much sunlight or it'll spoil, and then you have to take that all the way back to the entrance point, going basically back through the level. You'll have to jump between sources of shade and water sources to cool it off. All of the safe areas are just a hair farther than is comfortable, and every small trip is tense as you hope to make it to shade before the isotope is ruined. It's tuned really well. Now these are probably more tense to play solo, but you can grab a buddy as well, as these support co-op, letting you, be the one that carries around the isotope while they take out the bad guys. But while these are unique and fun, it's not just this mission set that's enjoyable, and I'm surprised by how many people complain that the side missions weren't fun like previous games. I got to fight an army of genetically engineered super chickens, and played a long DLC side quest modeled after Stranger Things with the opening theme and all. I followed a pelican cross-country to find a treasure stash, defended Danny Trejo so that Castillo's men couldn't capture him or his taco recipe.
It's the most lethal taco combo there is.
And I even got to help a Rambo superfan by mimicking the movies as best I could.
You actually showed up.
There's a ton of personality and levity here. It's really puzzling why all this good design was kept out of the main story, though. The story drags and only has a couple awesome encounters like the one on a ship that you have to take over like a pirate, then keep aircraft at bay with AA cannons on the deck. But beyond this, a lot of the mission design is basic and just features you holding up while an NPC does the thing and watching swarms of bad guys just sort of materialize and scurry around in their erratic patterns and accidentally dodge your shots a lot. Encounter designs are just messy, and I wish the tightness and love put into the side missions had overshadowed the shallow, almost cynically bland main missions. Speaking of messy, Far Cry 6 is the most technically unsound game I played from the Ubisoft. Strange glitches happened, like being unable to move once I loaded in, gunshots didn't sound sometimes even if reload sounds still happened, dialogue randomly went out, and more. I fell through the map once, and map markers for quests randomly disappeared or never appeared sometimes. I've already mentioned how the enemies just basically load into areas from inside walls or how crazy they act in combat. There's just this weird pall of unimmersiveness that crops up from time to time to let you know this isn't the same level of care as normal. And I guess that's the skinny on a rather chunky experience. I can't complain about all the creative, not-so-side missions, the new Supremo and Devolver weapons, or the actually nice quality of life things like being able to just walk over a dead body to loot it, or how all your weapons are available in your inventory once unlocked instead of stuck at supply lockers. A fair few amount of the side missions are creative fun and something you wish the rest of the game was in on. But for every decent idea, you'll be distracted by something smaller and annoying that just kind of pecks away at it. The world's honestly just way too big, so there's lots of dead space between objectives. You don't have that fun hunting and crafting loop anymore because materials materials to make things are in random crates. You can kill animals for their parts, but you're only selling them for money, not getting that cool immersive touch of feeling like you're living off the land by using their parts to craft your equipment. Combat always feels a little off because the aiming's loose and the AI acts so strangely, not to mention how nearly all non-stealth encounters turn into GTA 5-star showdowns with tanks and helicopters. But let's not forget how I didn't even know ammo type considerations were supposed to be a feature because it basically never comes up in game. Thank God my favorite gun happened to be the armor-piercing pistol called the Autograph. Let's also not forget how even if the gameplay wasn't so inconsistent, how lacking in narrative motivation you're likely to be. And it's not like Ubisoft doesn't know how to frame and pace a good story, it's just they've actively chosen to have childish characters and dialogue up against the big mean adults.
Nobody told me this was a party.
We're basically playing Cuban spy kids with TikTok agendas over here, and it just never plays or feels good. Castillo's just removed and underutilized from the game, and his cronies are deeply unmemorable. Let's not forget that your character Danny Rojas is voiced, a first for the series. You're not funny, you're not really brave or competent despite the game telling you that, and you have no leadership skills, despite being given countless responsibilities, because you're the main character.
Shit, you're really bad at this.
Yeah. Wow.
And while the game manages satisfying thrills like crashing helicopters into a crowd, or taking out tanks with your rocket Supremo, or killing an entire base of guys with your bow while alerting no one, there's just so many distractions or demotivators to caring about the moment to moment. Far Cry 6 inches the series forward in some areas, but it's basically a paint job over familiar assets and a story unworthy of the series. It's the definition of mediocrity, halfway up the side of a yarn mountain, but nothing outstanding. It's content to just coast, like a jet ski all the way out to Miami Beach, where Danny wants to go live someday. Maybe Ubisoft should follow her there, relax a bit, and then figure out why this entry was such a beach to love. And last but not least, a great big shout out to my increasing patron list. I'm so #blessed to have your hashtag support. Thank you. Many thanks to Shkotsky, Deadforge, Mark, Newpower, Shantiva, and a new traveler to our shores, A Blondie. Hey, Blonde! Oh, but on a serious note, please consider checking out my Patreon if you feel like my videos are worth the money and giving the entertainment that you're looking for. The only reason I make a special e-bag out of you is that while I'm not currently close to the YouTube monetization goal right now, the way the policies are going with that recent policy update that you saw, several people, big name people, get demonetized for a lot of their videos for the slightest, profanity or violence or anything like that. It's becoming increasingly hard if you're covering any type of action game or any game with any profanity, or if it's just in your script, to not get demonetized. So we're having to really go to the Patreon well more than anywhere else, because YouTube is not holding up their end of the bargain as people make content for the platform, bring people to the platform, and then they throttle the money that they can make while on the platform. So if you're feeling especially generous or just have the money to spare, please check out patreon.com/high-functioning medium. Help out the channel. It'll keep me around here longer, able to do bigger and better work on a more consistent basis. Them's the bins. I sure appreciate those who have watched, those who have supported financially as well. Thank you all, and may the rest of your day be aggressively above average. Peace.